All right. Thank you all for coming here and seeing me present my research. Thank you. So I want to clarify one thing. I lived in Bellevue, Idaho. So if you know anything about Indiana, I'm not the person to talk about it because I don't know if I've ever been to Indiana. But I just want to clarify, Idaho. Not to embarrass you, Kimberly. For my sake, I don't want any questions about Indiana because I'm going to fail horribly. So I have to admit it's very strange to hear Dr. Ward because, yes, I finally completed everything that's involved in the process of the doctoral, whatever I'm trying to say. I graduated. 7 years and I graduated. So I've been living with it a long time, and to be called doctor still sounds like, who are they talking about? But I guess I hope to get used to that. So again, this research is focused on my dissertation research and along my interests there and what makes counselors counselors and what kind of experiences they encounter along the way. But I want to open up with some questions to you all, like a good counselor perhaps. So I want to get a couple of folks, what is your understanding of counseling? Okay, so assistance, so maybe some support aspect, yeah. Listening, someone who hopefully is a good listener. You never know what you're going to get, though, when it comes to counseling. Okay, maybe kind of changing your perspective and maybe some ideas and exploration piece. Non-judgmental. All right. I think that's all very good things to expect and hopefully receive in counseling. I guess my next question, I think maybe you answered this already in that first question, but my next question was, what do you want in a counselor? What would you personally want if you were going to go see a counselor? Understanding? Okay, someone you're comfortable with, the trust part, the non-judgment piece? Yeah. Anything else? I'll get to that later. Yeah. Some resources, okay. Maybe some resources I don't know about or connection to those resources, how to find those resources. I guess my next one was, what might you think is involved in the process of becoming a counselor? Just kind of shooting out there. What do you think might be involved if someone's learning to be a counselor? Hours, so time commitment. So maybe experiencing counseling firsthand to see what that's like. Okay, so maybe some life experience is what you might value. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Okay, some experience. Okay, maybe some knowledge base. Yeah, for sure. So I just wanted to open up and kind of start thinking along these lines. Like, what does it mean to both, what is counseling and what does it mean to be a counselor? Because that's a lot of what my research was about and kind of the steps along the way on that journey. So speaking to my own experience as learning to become a counselor, I entered a counseling program not having any idea what counseling is. In my mind, I thought you laid on a couch and you talked and they kind of analyzed what you were saying. Or alternatively, kind of like Alan, I thought I would go in there and just list off all my problems and they would sit back and, yeah, and just kind of offer me solutions for those problems. So it was a rude awakening when I finally encountered what counseling was. I basically applied for this counseling program because I was looking for a career change. And they had scholarships, full ride scholarships for counseling. And I thought, hey, maybe this could be a good thing. And it was quite surprising what I encountered. So I wanted to check back to the presentation title here. So I was going to ask you your understanding or of this term sea change. What does sea change mean to all of you? Something with the tide? Something related to the tides? Waves? Okay, so it brings this imagery of maybe tides coming in and out and waves and maybe change and fluctuation or something like that. So this term is related to, make sure I get this right, a profound or notable transformation. And along with that idea for me is this idea that once you have that profound or notable transformation, that you don't necessarily return to that previous way of being. It's like this big shift. So after collecting data, talking to some folks and processing that data, I felt like this was an appropriate title in terms of folks did not exit the counseling programs that they attended the same people they were when they entered. So to get into it a little bit, let's see. What do we have? My introduction. So here we are. Individuals do not enter counseling programs inherently prepared to be counselors. Often students are expected to develop significantly during the training process, and it's not just related to skills, but it's communication and interpersonal skills and how you show up and how you engage with others, and you're expected to increase your self-awareness as well as other awareness and to grow personally and professionally. So this is typically a master's program, but in my view, sometimes you go a little beyond typically what we think of as a master's level education, in that not only are you expected to learn the material, but you're expected to grow, to develop on a personal level, which might be unique, but I think that's probably true in most master's levels education in some way or another. But this is really a focus in counseling programs. So counseling curriculum really targets areas of student growth such as cognitive complexity, empathy, open-mindedness, and personal and interpersonal awareness, which makes sense. But there's other factors outside of that. So Fur and Carroll talk about how students change as they progress through the educational process. And Murray and Kleiss talk about how personal change leads to students enacting interpersonal change. So this personal change that's expected of you as a developing counselor, but that change in and of itself oftentimes contributes to changes in important relationships because you're showing up in new and different ways. So relationship changes with family, friends, loved ones, significant others, and kind of globally in a way. However, there's very little research that talks about what these changes are and specifically how they might look. So we know that there's change, we expect change, but we don't really look deeper into it and say what are these changes and what could be the impact on that student of these changes. So that's what I was really curious about. Going back to my own personal experience, I saw a lot of relationship change and personal change, and it was very destabilizing in lots of ways. And I felt like I wasn't prepared for that. And I still feel like I live with the repercussions of that. Because oftentimes I have this sense of my family wants to hold on to who I was before I entered the counseling program without the acceptance of I'm no longer that person. So there can be some rigidity regarding this change and some pushback. And so I was curious, how did other people, what did they encounter and how did they manage these things? And maybe, am I the exception or is this more like a global experience? So review of literature. I think the important aspects of this is distinguish between these different terminologies. So personal growth is unstructured, non-specific, and holistic, and often isn't noticed as you're going through it, but you notice it in reflection. Then we have personal development, change that is purposeful, structured, and specific, which focus on developing skills and qualities, on enhancing a trainee's professional effectiveness. Then we have professional development is kind of gaining knowledge and skills related to counseling. So oftentimes these terms are kind of like rolled into one, but they can be and should be kind of distinctly identified so we can really recognize what's happening for the student and what programs are expecting of them. And then this is just a framework for understanding changes for counselors. I looked at, we have Ronstadt and Scoville, and they came up, I think, with 8 stages for developing counselors. I really focused on the first 3 because that was the most applicable. The lay helper basically is, I'm someone good that's someone who's good to talk to because I listen. So all my friends come to me when they have problems. I don't necessarily have counseling skills or knowledge, but they come to me because I'm a good listener. I'm kind of their go-to person. That's how it looks in my everyday life. So I feel like, hey, maybe I might be appropriate for counseling. But then you enter the counseling program, you become a beginning student, and you transition from lay helper to beginning student. You start acquiring knowledge and skills around counseling. And then you have advanced student with higher levels of skills and knowledge, and they're able to better integrate these skills into their personal behaviors and their professional behaviors, whereas as a beginning student, it's kind of separate. I know these things, but I don't know what to do with them. Advanced student is like, I know these things, I'm starting to know what to do with them. Any questions or thoughts at this point in time? All right. All right, so again, counselor training, student change. It's more than developing academically or professionally. They must grow and develop personally. And again, most studies focus on how they change or develop professionally rather than this kind of personal growth piece. So interpersonal relationships. So Dahl here notes that it becomes apparent to those who teach counselors that they're not just serving the student in front of them, but they're impacting the larger system. So they're impacting the folks that these students are in relationship with, family, friends, so forth and so on, like I talked about earlier. And so we need to be aware of that and try to think about how we can support these students who might be, through their education, be experiencing this like broader change and how and the stressors of that broader change, and acknowledge these things and maybe how we could kind of address those things in the classroom. Some of the areas that change people encounter as students is stress on personal relationships related to time commitment, mental and emotional energy commitment to their program. The role confusion. Oftentimes there's this confusion for new counselors. Am I your friend? Am I your family? Or am I your counselor? And how to differentiate between those and draw those boundaries that are appropriate. Oftentimes new students experiment with their new skills with family members and family members and friends, which is oftentimes puts stress on the relationship, and it can really piss those people off that you're in a relationship with. Inability to leave school at school, this idea that we're always analyzing every interaction we have with someone through a kind of a psychological lens rather than this old natural way of being. I'm analyzing this interaction with you. I'm analyzing your behavior, whereas I might not have been prior to my training. A lot of self-reflection and examining relationships. Oftentimes making intentional changes to relationships, like establishing new boundaries. Because we learn about boundaries and healthy boundaries in our training, and so we suddenly feel like, oh, we got to do this in our relationships, which is something. I'm sure people have experience with boundaries in here. Yeah.
What is a healthy boundary?
A healthy boundary. So, a philosophical question. I think a healthy boundary is a way that's kind of balances your needs versus what you're going to give to others. So we have this idea that people have rigid boundaries where they're very rigid with their interactions with others. They really don't have as much of this give and take in relationships. They can be very firm with their boundaries. Then we have these permanent boundaries where they let people kind of, what you'd say, walk over them, or they don't really acknowledge or appreciate that person's needs, and this person doesn't stand up for themselves. So the healthy boundary is a balance between the two. I'm not rigid in that I'm holding people away from me, but I'm not like this permeable where people are violating my boundaries and taking advantage of me and all these things like that. All right, good question. Students, so we're focusing on personal growth. So this idea that I'm hyper-focused on my personal growth, maybe I could, the person I'm partnered with might not be experiencing the same personal growth, and I might outgrow them, and the relationship is no longer matching. So it can cause relationship disruption. And they often say grad school is where relationships go to die. There's high levels of divorce rates among graduate students. So partners holding I think I wrote this wrong, but basically having new standards for your intimate relationships, new expectations, higher levels of expectations. And then this idea that counselors start, because of their education and their knowledge base, that family and friends start deferring to them in terms of like, oh, I'm having a problem with this, my boyfriend, this, that, the other, what do you think I should do? Whereas they wouldn't do that previously. So this idea of expertise can change relationships. And then counselor training is the butterfly effect, is what I talked about earlier. Is like there's more of a global impact on students than just what's restricted to the classroom. Methodology. So my research question, how does counselor education training impact influence the interpersonal relationships of counselors in training? And I had an interpretive phenomenological analysis, which is a qualitative method based on interviews. This is kind of a popular method right now because it's more structured than just general phenomenology. But it still maintains some flexibility that phenomenology is useful for phenomenology. So it includes phenomenology, ideography, and hermeneutics. And then my sample, I had 7 folks. You can see some demographics here, how they identified and maybe their level of education and their experience with mental health. So I had 2 people identified as male and the other 5 identified as female. And I conducted a 60-minute Zoom interview with these folks because this was the middle of the pandemic. So, and then I had some follow-up interviews with 3 participants, and 2 participants provided me feedback by email, and 2 more folks didn't respond to my efforts to follow up, which was essentially saying, this is my findings of the study. How do you feel about this? Does this fit your experience? So it's a kind of trustworthiness within IPA that can be kind of almost equated to, even though qualitative researchers argue the point, kind of equated to quantitative validity and reliability sort of thing. So my findings. So I had 3 subordinate themes of confusion and insecurity, growing pains, and overcoming and resilience, with numerous sub-themes and subtopics, which we'll get into a little bit more. So really, I guess looking at confusion and insecurity, we look at professional and personal identity and integration, which, if you're not familiar with counselor training, I think could be complex. But this idea is to be your best version of your counseling self, you must find a way to both have a counselor identity and a personal identity, and then an integration of the two. which takes time and a lot of discomfort. So initially, as a beginning student, oftentimes students are pretty rigid about who they are as a counselor, their counselor identity. But that can be sterile and off-putting in a way. And so you try to kind of infuse a little bit of who you are as a person into that. But it's hard to recognize where one begins and the other ends in a way. And oftentimes they're pretty rigid initially, but as you get more experience and so forth, they start to integrate more seamlessly. Any questions on that? Yeah.
So in your study, or in your experience, how unique is the personality of the psychotherapist or counselor to the needs of a particular person? In other words, can a really competent professional counselor counsel almost everybody or anyone?
Mm-hmm.
Or does that personality of that individual need to match up with the particular kind of individual?
I think that is a complex question, and I would say you should be able to work with anyone, but sometimes it's part of being like a responsible consumer on the part of the client to say, whatever it is about this person's not meeting what I need. So maybe I should look for someone that provides that comfort and whatever I need. You ask a complex question because people have kind of what they want out of a counselor. Like say, maybe I want a male counselor, or maybe I want an older male counselor, or maybe I want a female, or, I mean, those are just demographic things, but sometimes I want like a certain personality type in a way I feel like they kind of get me and we can relate in a different way. Does that answer your question at all? Okay. So I think the counselor should have the skills and the ability to counsel anyone, but there's like a more nuanced piece of what does the client really need in that relationship, and maybe they can only get that from a different counselor. So. I thought so.
So, yeah, just the general appearance of a counselor. Is that an important factor?
Appearance?
Well,
oh, okay.
For example, if I was going to seek a counselor, I wouldn't want to walk up to a guy that's all pink.
That's funny.
Like
That's funny because that's exactly what I was thinking. Is I know many counselors that part of their identity, who they are, is they would wear an Anthrax T-shirt and have sleeves, and that shouldn't impact their ability to counsel in any way. That's them being what they feel is authentically themselves. Depending on where they work, that might fly or that might not fly. But really, it's like your perception of that. Is that going to cause you to doubt their professional ability? And so are you going to enter into that counseling room doubtful in a way in which it's going to I lost my train of thought, kind of negatively impact your ability to get what you need out of that relationship? Very good questions, but not easy. So, wow. Okay, thank you. Okay, so we have professional and personal identity integration, and then we have mental health and responsibility of self and others, and then we have reassurance. So basically, we have this experience of struggling to integrate information behaviors learned through training into one's personal identity. And then we have indecision and confusion within interactions carried out with friends, families, partners, characterized by counselors finding it difficult to distinguish between their personal counseling selves. So I don't know. It's kind of hard to wrap your mind around if you haven't experienced it, but how do I show up in a relationship now that I knew all these new skills? Do I show up at... Sure. Yeah.
So when I was going through training, I thought all of a sudden I was extremely brilliant, and I would bring these little nuggets of information that I had learned in class to my parents, and I'd be like, oh, Dad, did you see what she just did? And I would do this during dinner, and I would point out like these relationship quirks or like flaws that I was noticing, because I was trying to go from someone who was completely just myself to like a total professional in all settings, even when it was entirely inappropriate, right? But that was not appropriate for me to be trying to be an asshole counselor for my parents during dinner. But I didn't know how to like balance these things. I don't know. Is that
I think it's definitely an example. Is that helpful to understand? Imagine you send your child away to college and they come back and they're psychoanalyzing you over dinner. Like, could that be a problem? Yeah. So these are the problems. Yeah. So these are the problems with integration of the professional and personal self. Where does one begin? Where does the other end? Ideally, we want to integrate them seamlessly in a functional, appropriate manner. But in the initial stages, it doesn't come out as functional or appropriate, because it's still in process of developing. So really through the IPA research model, we like to let the participants speak for themselves. So for these themes, I have provided quotes from my participants. Hi. So exploration stage, this idea that you're learning new information, you're getting it dumped on you, you don't know what to do with it. And then we have the experimental stage. I've learned some skills, I've learned some information. I really want to practice on folks, even though I'm told to not do that at school, because, again, people take it the wrong way. And then we have what I call the solidification stage. This isn't the end-all, be-all where you've arrived, but you start to feel more secure of who you are as a beginning counselor, and then kind of integrating that knowledge and skills more comfortably into who you are in everyday life in an appropriate way. You're not there, but you feel more comfortable about it, and you're balancing all this stuff a little more effectively. And maybe less socially, I just lost my word again. Less socially abrasive, annoying. And then we have mental health, self, and responsibility. So folks get all this training around mental health, and they start applying to themselves. So they start to view themselves in an entirely different way. And a lot of times they have a hard time making sense of that or balancing that. And oftentimes if they can't solve their own problems, they feel like, since I have all this knowledge and training, then I'm a bit of a failure. So this perception of self can change and can be discouraging. And then you have others. Like, where does my responsibility fall with others now that I have all this education and training? Do I have increased responsibility for others' mental health? What's appropriate? When is appropriate? What is appropriate? When is it appropriate? And what kind of boundaries should there be? So some confusion and insecurity around these things. And discouragement. Then reassurance. Basically, at this point in development, counseling students really need to be told it's all going to be okay. Because think about it, a lot of self-reflection, a lot of self-growth, a lot of pushing yourself, always kind of forcing you to change, yourself to change, creates a sense of anxiety. And oftentimes these students at this point in time would reach out to these established relationships, whether it was family or friends or loved ones, romantic relationships, and say, just tell me I'm going to be okay, that I'm going to get through this, that I'm okay the way I am. Because that kind of sense of I'm going to be okay has been really destabilized. Because you're in this active process of changing, actively changing. Then we have theme 2, growing pains, relational imbalances and disequilibrium, and loneliness. So the students reported a broad range of challenges, obstacles, and upsets within important relationships and dynamics. And then oftentimes these experiences were perceived as bad not good, unpleasant, uncomfortable, painful. So relational depth. So here you can see Chris talking about he had a friend, a long-term friend that he'd known for 15 years or so, I don't recall. Very satisfied with his friendship. That was one of his better friends. Suddenly he started to recognize that his friendship was all about drinking beer, partying, watching football, and suddenly it felt very superficial. And prompted by his training, he wanted to deepen this relationship, which wasn't entirely well received by his friend. So it created this kind of disequilibrium in the relationship. Reciprocity and mutuality. People started to notice when relationships were one-sided, that maybe they weren't getting as much out of the relationship as they're putting into it. And they became discontent with this. And then expectations and selectivity in relationships. People expected more of their friends. They expected more of their relationships. They established higher standards, and that caused discomfort in the relationships. They were changing, they were growing, they were trying to better themselves. They expected that from other folks as well. And people became a lot more selective in romantic relationships, by a lot. And then we have the idea that ignorance is bliss. So once they've learned all these practices, this information, they've become generated this other awareness, this interpersonal awareness, this awareness of themselves. They've become to start to analyze things, situations, people, interactions through a psychological lens. They found they couldn't turn it off, and they're happy not knowing these things. But I can't undo it. I was more content when I was ignorant. But there's no going back at this point. Relationship dynamic inversion is essentially like these relationship dynamics have changed due to their education or their sense of expertise. So at one time, a student maybe deferred to an older sister, followed her advice and her guidance and advice. But suddenly, within that relationship, her expertise around counseling and psychology, suddenly the sister might start deferring to that person. So a change in relationship dynamics. Emotional fatigue, basically all this self-reflection work, awareness of others and yourself, and working with clients and constantly self-examining yourself. It just wore you out, mentally, physically, emotionally. You felt like you didn't have anything left for your relationships outside of school. So oftentimes relationships would suffer from neglect, because people are just looking to recharge outside of class. And then we have loneliness. So again, but once you start becoming so self-reflective, it's hard to look outside of yourself. And you start to feel isolated. And if you have a group of people, a classroom, a cohort of people doing the exact same thing, heavily self-reflecting, they oftentimes feel disconnected from everyone around them. And then also there's that emotional fatigue part where you don't want to interact with others because you don't have enough battery left. And so you also can contribute to this sense of isolation. Alone together, that's kind of, I jumped ahead, this alone together piece is people oftentimes found isolated even within their cohorts. So the people that they're training with should best be able to understand their experience, they feel isolated from. So that's part of the isolation piece in the training program is you don't know what that person is experiencing unless you yourself have experienced it. So if you say, I'm a counseling student at large, everyone else in your sphere is not going to understand what you're going through because they're not experiencing it. It's very unique in that way, so that can also feel isolating. But then there's the element of feeling isolated within the folks who should best understand you because they're experiencing the same or similar things. Diminished connection. So this idea of the time commitment is taken away from your connection with others. And then we have theme 3, overcoming and resilience, ruptures and repairs, outright benefits, self-prioritization. So this focuses on the more positive aspects of the counselor training experience. So you have the confusion, you have the relationship disequilibrium, and then you kind of come out on the other side. And these are the kind of benefits of going through this process. But it's kind of like a recovery process in lots of ways. So we have ruptures and repairs. So even though relationships were damaged in some way for all the previous reasons I listed, emotional fatigue, maybe inappropriate interactions regarding counseling your friends or so forth and so on, with the counseling skills you have, you develop the confidence that you can repair the relationships, and you have the skills to make the effort to repair the relationships. If you deem the relationships are important enough to repair, oftentimes people assess and say, that relationship wasn't serving me, so I'm just going to let it lie where it is. Then we have outright benefits, increased awareness. All the participants said, I like that I have more awareness of myself. I find it's useful and helpful and serves my purposes. A lot of people really valued, we had the theme earlier said reassurance. That kind of going back to that is people really learn to value those who supported them during this time because they really need their support. So you really kind of narrowed who was there for you. And in many of those ways, those bonds were strengthened and people really appreciated the encouragement and the support they had during this very trying period of their counseling training. Strengthen connection. So oftentimes people kind of used what they learned about themselves and the skills they learned in counseling to help strengthen their connections with others. As you think back to a previous theme, we said dissatisfaction with relational depth. So people really try to deepen those relationships and then felt the relationships that did survive were strengthened. Self-prioritization was a big one. The understanding of the importance of taking care of yourself. Because oftentimes people go into relationships thinking, how do I prove that I care? Is I sacrifice my time, my energy, my own self-interests, or I absorb abuse in some way or another, and I stick in there. But people start to recognize that that's not how I show that a relationship is important to me. How I show a relationship is important to me is by drawing those healthy boundaries, because it serves both me and the other person. And the confidence to establish those healthy boundaries and hold to them, which was another thing. You can establish them or try to establish them, but you oftentimes kind of let them go because they take too much energy and work. But this kind of self-investment piece where I'm going to maintain that boundary because it's for the best of both of us. Maybe you can think about, if you're a parent, boundaries with your children and how you can recognize this is what the child needs and this is what I need. And then when you get tired, you're like, I'll do it tomorrow. Self-advocacy, I think I described the wrong one, but self-advocacy and boundary setting, people felt a greater drive to advocate for themselves and take care of themselves. Implications. I don't know if we need to get into the implications because that was mostly about how we can change counseling programs to better support students when encountering these kind of challenges along the way. So I think this is a good time to just bounce back to you all and say, what questions you got? Yeah.
So I guess this kind of goes with the implication. Knowing what the process looks like is certainly informative for someone incoming in.
Mm-hmm.
But some of the quotes looked at, I wish there would have been a class where we kind of talked about some of these elements. Were there classes offered that provided space for that, or were there other resources like mentor-mentee relationships that helped explore some of these in process or beyond?
I would say no. I mean, you could maybe bring it up, but this isolation piece, that theme is like, oftentimes people suspected that I'm experiencing this solely and no one else is experiencing this. And if I bring it up in class, it'll make me seem somehow not capable up to the task, that maybe I'm not capable of being a counselor. And so oftentimes these things became hidden. So part of this research was saying, as professors, we should address these as normal challenges and normalize it in a way that people can bring it up and we can process it and we can help support them around these things they might be encountering. Good question. And it's all in implications, so you know where I was going with that. Yeah. Yeah.
So how many of these problems or issues and what you notice do you think are unique to the field of counseling, and how many do you think are actually shared, like grad school in general? Because you're in that liminal state when you're in grad school, you're going through that process. And I feel like a lot of things you described, like I went through that isolation of losing friends and like these transition phases, and I know a lot of people who've been through grad school would probably describe the same thing. So like, how many of these are unique to counseling in general?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question because I haven't participated in other fields of study, so I don't really know what that looks like. But the way I want to look at it is that they are very focused in counseling on you, how you show up, how you present, how you interact. Even if you have any kind of past trauma or something that might get in the way of serving other people. If you have that past trauma or whatever it may be, you're going to have to address it and take care of it. I don't know of other programs that are like, hey, I know you're in chemistry, but I sense that you have some kind of past trauma and we need you to work through that before we move to the next stage. So you know what? I mean, I think there's got to be a difference there. But I don't know. I think these could be common to graduate school as well. And it might even depend on where your age group when you're going to grad school. I was a non-traditional student. I don't know about other folks. Can I go to Mark real quick?
I just was going to kind of dovetail on that and ask if, are you aware of any studies that looked at it? It's obviously difficult for people to do. I doubt that anyone who was in the counselor training program said, yeah, piece of cake, this was no problems, no challenges, no issues in my work or private life or anything like that. So you add on top of that the difficulty of processing and helping other people deal with some very, very difficult issues too. So are there studies that look at dropout rate or burnout after so many years?
There's a lot of studies around burnout for counselors because it's really high, and a lot of studies around how we can prevent that. It's probably equitable to the whole teacher burnout, I would think. I think it's the service industry. Do we call it, or helping? What do we call it? Where you give, and then you get tired, and then you give some more, and then you forget to take care of yourself. So I'm going to jump over to Emily real quick.
Were there any commonalities among your participants along like gendered lines? So did you find like men, people who identified as men, tended to struggle with one aspect as well?
I think you're asking me a really hard question, but I don't know if I looked for that, and maybe.
I guess could you see the commonality split among gender lines just based on how, like, maybe men are taught to process feelings versus
It really seemed to be dependent on the individual. I mean, if I went back to the data, maybe I could recognize some kind of gendered differences, but I wasn't really looking for that. But I did notice differences based on the individual, and I think that's a large part of that is their relationship with self and others. Is if they came in, it seemed to be coming out of this, is if they came into the program in good mental health standing, they might struggle, but they come back on the other side and be in a better spot. But the folks who came in with poor mental health seem to struggle more. Similarly with relationships, those who struggled with maybe poor relationships might have struggled more as well. So I'm not really sure how to answer that question. I'm going to jump over here. Sorry, I'm going to go in order here. Alan?
This actually jumps off. Emily kind of took my first part of my question, and this is going to kind of flow with it. Do you mind if we jump back to the demographic page?
All right.
Since this is dealing a lot with relationships and how you interact with people in the counselor training program and those that aren't, I was actually going to ask about gender lines as well, but then you also took demographic information that identifies where they fall on the Kinsey scale, essentially. That 1 to 4 to 1 down. And some of those are non-standard, non-typical relationships. Do you feel that anything along those lines, in addition to any gender or maybe differences, that may have affected or interacted with some of the data?
I didn't really look at it from that angle, and I would probably have to look at it to see if there's a difference. But I could be completely wrong, but I actually think this kind of demographic is fairly typical in counseling programs that I've encountered. I mean, I can't say I haven't studied or collected numbers, but from my experience of being in counseling programs, we do have a lot of diverse identities that show up. And there's also this idea that folks are attracted to counseling programs or to becoming counselors because they themselves have encountered personal challenges and want to kind of work with others along those lines and help and support those folks. But I wish I had a good answer for you. Then we had Joel.
Yeah. So I guess my question is, you're counseling somebody, how do you gauge your success?
This is interesting because I have a counselor in training that I'm supervising, and this is kind of what we were talking about last week. So how do I judge my success? I think it's really going to be put back on the client in terms of how they perceive how effective counseling is.
I guess that's really my question. How would you gauge whether or not you're effectively counseling somebody and whether or not what you're saying to that person is having an impact on their well-being?
I think that's up for them to decide, And I think this is hard, but one of the biggest indicators that you're not being an effective counselor is they stop showing up. Yeah. But otherwise, that's on them. And the idea, because I think there's two sides to this coin. There's the client perception of what's going on, and then my perception of what's going on. And we're coming from kind of two different perspectives that I don't know if they'll entirely ever mesh in terms of what I'd like to see is positive change on their part consistently over time. That's how I would judge some kind of success. However, the reality is people really are cyclical. They're gonna really kind of be on this improvement path, and then they're going to kind of regress into something, depending on their experiences in life, what's coming up for them in the moment.
Is there a longitudinal follow-up? With somebody who was a patient?
Not unless you see them in the grocery store and they look really good. I don't know. People just kind of come in and out of your life based on their needs and where you're working and if you're still working there. And I don't know, Sarah, Do you have any kind of insight?
Yeah, I think it's really just the client gets to make those choices, and the client gets to decide when they're ready to leave, and the client gets to decide when they need to come back. And it's so different than, I think of like a science, like the science that you are an expert in, and there are such finite answers. Like it's very clear. Or I would like to say more so than I guess the field that we're in. And we really have to give that trust back to the client and let them decide for themselves. I feel like I'm in a stable and a balanced place, and I'll see you when I need you again. And that has to be acceptable because it's their life that they're living, and they can make that choice, and they get to call success. Because I just decide success for a client, then I'm telling them that I'm the expert in the room, and that's never the case.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Is you want your clients not to need you. That's what you're working on. That they don't need you, they don't need your support, they don't need these things. And when they tell you, I don't want to see you every week, I want to see you every other week, then I want to see you every month or every other, and then they're like, let's take a break. I mean, that would be success. Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Sarah. Clinton, you had something?
Yes, Mr. Ward. How have you found ways to integrate your knowledge into the teaching profession here at Otero? Have you found ways to integrate this knowledge that you have?
Mm-hmm.
Have you been able to bring that into your teaching, into the teaching profession, into your capacity here?
Yeah, I think that's a hard one because I'm not teaching counseling here. I'm teaching psychology. So.
Are you able to find? I mean, are you able to apply this in a real world scenario?
What happened? So what do we have? I don't know, Clinton. I mean, I try to promote increased awareness in class. I try to encourage students to become connected with one another, to have that support. Maybe increase comfort in class so they feel more comfortable kind of sharing their ideas. And I try to definitely build self-efficacy and self-advocacy, but I don't really have a framework to directly apply what I learned here in the classroom as it is now. So. Did you have something, Cass?
Well, as Kimberly said, are there like overlaps between grad school in general, but maybe with your experience teaching, do you see some of our students going through some of these same challenges that they've learned, or not necessarily in a specific discipline, but like a general education? Do they still become faced with some of these challenges?
I think I don't. My final answer is I don't know. I imagine this whole like professional personal identity integration could be it, because there's a lot of, or should be a lot of, identity exploration in college and professional exploration in college, and then how do we mesh these two? And I don't know. I feel like there's a lot of fear around like I don't know what I want to be. And I feel like if I choose a path, maybe I'm locked into it, and then I've made a choice, and I'm going to regret that choice. So kind of developing some kind of comfort around doing that exploration piece and having support from maybe us and peers around doing that kind of exploration piece, and then trying to find a level of comfort around that. I think students definitely get kind of burned with their schedule here in terms of classwork, and maybe if they're involved in sports and kind of juggling too much stuff, and that doesn't leave much for other things maybe. I don't have a great Great answer for you. Yeah. So I invited a few folks that I said, if you're interested in becoming trained as a counselor, you feel like you want to go that direction, please come. And I recognize some faces in here that I know have interests in being counselors. I'm wondering if this was helpful, and you don't have to speak up if you don't want to, if this is helpful or scary, or you want to clarify anything. It's helpful? Okay. Yeah.
I won't be counseling my sister again.
Okay, well, lesson number 1. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, hey.
Question. Do you think there, in the kind of grad school realm of things, do you think there are additional philosophical disciplines that could be combined with the current programs that are in place? So what's taught in those courses?
Oh.
Other that are, yeah, I guess just different philosophical disciplines that mix into that.
Like taking like an established curriculum and kind of infusing things that might be helpful for the students into it? Yeah. I would love to see that. But then you offer that to an instructor and they'd say, where do I put it? Again, so we have a lot on our plate, and how do we prioritize things that we feel would be helpful for just like personal growth on the part of the student, and where might it fit in this curriculum that's jammed full of things. So with me in psychology, it's a little easier because I can relate a lot of things to psychology that involve kind of self-reflection and working on yourself, if students choose to do that. But other fields, I'm not sure. It feels like it could fit in the communication and in the, what do we have? What do we have? Composition. Do we have composition classes? What do we call them? We just call it English? That seems too easy. Okay. Yeah. Okay. It feels like you could find a home maybe in there in terms of what are we reading and what are we writing about, kind of directing assignments around that. I don't know. What do you all think? A lot of you are instructors. What do you think?
There's a lot of overlap in the communications, like just the interpersonal communication stuff. But I mean, I can't help but review the material and get different perspectives on it, and try to get students to reflect on their communication choices. But then I go home and have a conversation with Miss Lytle on, hey, we reviewed this term. How do we do this? Whether she wants to analyze that or not. So I see a lot of overlap there.
Yeah. Cool.
It's really interesting. If you get a group of instructors from all kinds of different fields, the one thing that is always discussed is the students. That's just experienced that yesterday. When you do get a group of people together that are teachers, they're talking about teaching. And so I would see that as being an interdisciplinary understanding. Just my thoughts.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think in the room right now, I don't know everyone's education experience training, but certainly there are 2 folks who are professionally qualified counselors. But I think what the questions that are asked, that the process, that kind of organic, self-exploratory thing that has to happen is involved in every facet of what we do with students, in terms of trying to encourage them to, kind of try and figure out who you are. We're here to help you do that, and then we're here to help you achieve goals. But we can't set your goals for you any more than your parents can, and if they do, it'll be a disaster, et cetera, et cetera. So it's tough.
Yeah.
It's not an easy business. I know certainly from a family member's, long experience now. professional counseling, it's a tough gig, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Or can be.
Yeah, just like teaching, maybe.
Sometimes.
Yeah. Well, if we don't have any more questions, I feel like we. Okay.
How do you feel about teaching compared to counseling? Do you miss counseling? Do you
Oh boy.
prefer counseling?
I like counseling in increments. I think that's why I transitioned over to teaching over here, is because I miss teaching. Counseling feels important and significant, but a lot of it's just kind of one-on-one, and I feel like I get part of that, kind of addressing kind of a group of folks without some of the things that used to deplete me with counseling. So in some ways I'm getting that need met of, I feel like I'm supporting and helping folks and doing what I feel like is important to life without kind of really getting depleted in terms of that very heavy material you sometimes have in counseling. Yeah. Oh, what's up, Joseph?
I always think of like the counseling presentation in your personal relationships, right? Those kind of interpersonal affordances.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find it difficult as a teacher to be a teacher,
Mm-hmm.
not a counselor?
No, I don't. Well, sometimes I kind of roll into counseling a slight bit, but then I'm like, whoa, back off, because with counseling, you can open up a whole box of what we don't have time to mess with, and it's not appropriate at the same time. So I think I can use counseling skills to maybe encourage people and help them feel comfortable, but sometimes I see or hear things where I'm like, I suspect something's going on there, and we're not going to open up in class because it's not appropriate, you know? So kind of being mindful around that. I think that's a good question. But I think if you would ask me that question earlier on in my counseling experience, it might be a different answer. I think I've learned some of my lessons about kind of poking at things that are none of my business. Yeah, good question. Exciting, too. You could have got any answer. And Gary's here, so I could be in trouble. No. All right. Anyone else have any other questions or comments? Did you have something, Adam? Oh, you're just... All right. Well, I appreciate all you coming out and staying so late. It's been wonderful, and thank you so much.